mercy is so great that you look beyond our weakness and find pure as gold in miry clay. Lord, your mercy is so great. I will always sing that you look here on earth and ever after. For you've shown me heaven's my true home. When it's all been said and done, you're my life when life is done. When it's all been said and done, there is just one thing that matters. Did I do my best to live for truth? Did I live my
Good evening, everybody. Hope all of us are doing well. Today we have come for the 16th session of our Old Testament survey. Today we'll be looking through the wonderful writing, the prophetical literature that we have from Daniel. Before we start, let us look to the Lord in prayer. Let's together pray. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this time. Lord, we pray as we learn the writing of Daniel. Lord, we pray that you speak to us, help us to understand the various aspects of truth that we can find from the writing, and help us, Lord, to be faithful, like how Daniel and his friends were in a pagan land. And we pray, Lord, that learning about them will challenge us, Lord, to in a time of compromising, in a time of quitting. Lord, we pray that you will help us to stay strong in faith and to remain in your love. In Jesus' name, we together pray. Amen. We understand that the writing of I think the host access is gone to. Can someone give me the share access?
Hey, I'm so sorry. I wasn't aware I'm logged in as let me just quickly make you host. Yeah, there you go. Sorry.
So the book of Daniel is like one of the favorite writings of a lot of people. Probably most of us would have heard so many sermons from the book of Daniel, and especially from the first six chapters. And that is why it is known as a book of a lot of polarities. Uh, it is one of the most simplest as well as a little complex book of the Bible to understand. Now we know when we look through the writing of Esther, we understood the challenging times that Israel had to face in the foreign times, from a setting of someone from power. Now, Esther was also someone in power. Now these Daniel and his friends were also taken as people of power into the exile. Now we understand that it was not the normal laymen who were suffering, who was given hard work to do, but even those who are in political positions, even their situations were not safe, is what we are able to find. So when we look at the writing of Daniel, as I mentioned, it is one of the simplest as well as the most complex books of the Bible. The first six stories are like the favorites of many children, and we have those stories as cartoons, and all of those very well put up in different settings. Our children love them, and so on. But from the next part of the book, from chapter 7 onwards, there are so many debates, there are so many scholarly opinions, there are different nuances to looking at the writing. But we have to understand that this book is a powerful witness to God's power over evil. Now, through the book, I've been studying the book for the past couple of days as I was preparing for the session, and I was challenged because on one side we see how the oppression, how the beast of the evil world is rising up, and how the people of God are oppressed. But on one side, how God is working and how God's power is becoming victorious over evil. And this is a mystery. That's how some scholars call it. There's a mystery, but that's how God works, even in oppression. It is the people of God who are in a winning battle, and that we can clearly see in the writing of Daniel. Let's quickly look at some of the overviews that we can find. As I mentioned, one of the interests that I have today is to look through apocalyptic writings and see how apocalyptic type of writings function in Old Testament, particularly now, but also this can be very related to Revelation in the New Testament. Also, some of last week we looked at the last few chapters of Ezekiel. I've quickly gone through it, but there are various nuances of eschatological understanding, and maybe looking at that portions also from this light of eschatology it will be able to help us. But let us come to that in a while. So Daniel, as we all know it, in 605 BC, was taken to captive in the third year of Jehoiakim's reign, and he was the provincial administrator in Babylon, and later he became the Persian courts, as some suggest it. So we understand that he was taken at a very young age, but rose to power and got good of political offices in Babylonian empires, and he had tremendous pressure from political side. Now, when we think about it, it might look like a privilege that he had. It might look as if he never had to suffer anything. That's not true. We have a couple of instances within the text itself where we see that Daniel was tremendously pressured, and he had many enemies because of the ethics that he carried, not because of anything else. But we see Daniel being a faithful man, and God had blessed him with amazing capabilities of wisdom and the unique gift of interpreting dreams and the symbolic prophecies about the future. This gift we do not see being in many people in the Bible, but we see this in Daniel. And so we understand that one of the concerns here is in regard to authorship, especially by a lot of liberal scholars. Now, if we see the second half of the writing, that is from Daniel chapter 7 onwards, there are various instances where Daniel is referring to in first person. He is talking as if as if I am talking it. I am Daniel, and I am narrating it in that way he is talking it. But before that, it is in a third person writing that we are able to find this entire book. So a lot of people kind of have a difference of opinion on the authorship. Now, also the understanding of the angelic command of Daniel to seal the words of the scroll in Daniel chapter 12, that we see as one of the supporting aspect of Daniel being the author. And there are internal evidences, the vision reports that we are able to see how strongly, if these vision reports have to come, it probably would have come from the original source itself, is another opinion that is existing. Also, this can be framed by a third person also, but however, most likely there is a good way of looking at it because of the difference of times, which I'll come in the next slide. Because of the huge span of time that this is covering, a lot of people suggest that there is also an editor involved in this particular writing. The reason I take up these authorship parts, I know this can sometimes wonder why do we have to do all this, but the reason why I take this is because in recent times is when in the biblical scholarship, a lot of liberal scholars have got into and are challenging the authenticity of God's word by stating about authorship and how a lot of they take some grammatical instances and they try to apply that into various instances and say that this is not by this author and so on. And sometimes that entire claim might be or entire authenticity of the book might be lost. So it is important for us to know a little bit of background so that when we talk to people, we'll be able to stand our grounds and defend it when it is needed. Also, a story like Daniel is well known not just in Christian circles but also in outside. So this helps us to understand. Also, the third person identity is well structured in the first 6 chapters that we are able to see in Daniel. So there is a support for the claims that Daniel is a partial author with an editor who added on with the biography of Daniel. Now, the internal evidence requires only the first person visions of the second half of the book be accepted as directly from Daniel. However, these are precisely the portions of the book that are most contested due to their extraordinary predictions of later history. Now, when we are coming to the end of Daniel, this is going back to the 2nd century, whereas what we are right now dealing with Daniel is in the time of empire where Nebuchadnezzar and the initial time of the exile. So that is one of the struggles that people have in understanding about it, and they break their heads with thinking who's the author. Some people believe that it was written after the prophecy also, like they call it as the prophecy after the fact, and this is a terminology that a lot of liberal and also some good scholars used to say that probably they have in the 2nd century an incident might have happened that we see in the book of Daniel, and because of that is the reason why after the event in exam might have added and so on. So these are some of the opinions, but we have to understand that that's a highly skeptic reading of the text, because we believe in biblical prophecy, and biblical prophecy has a lot of ground where Bible can predict the future, as in the prophets can predict the future, and this was written down by the prophets, and it would have happened in the 2nd century. So Daniel, who is in a 6th century figure, is prophesying about the 2nd century incident that is happening. And technically, there are people who still don't agree fully that it was 2nd century. There are people who still says, it is the times to come. Some say it was Roman Empire. So a lot of views in regard to the book of the later part of Daniel also exist. However, we can easily conclude that Daniel and probably an editor would have been the ideal looking at it as the authorship of Daniel. So the authenticity remains with Daniel, and he is the source behind what we are writing. And this is historically, a lot of these details are historically taken up also. So looking at the historical background, now we by now know a lot of these details, but just repeating it. So we understand that the Babylonians had declared their independence from the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were at one point of time the superpowers, but Babylonians were slowly taking that power. And we also see that they had allied themselves with the Medes to the east, and by that they were trying to test the Assyrians, the strength of the Assyrians. And by 612, we see the Nineveh had completely fallen off from the map. And with this collapse of the government, the Assyrians had completely wiped off, or they were no more existing, other than becoming like a study material for a lot of them. And that is when Babylon had come into the power, and Nebuchadnezzar had in 605 taken a complete power, and he assumed the control over all the territories that Assyrians were in control, including Judah. Now we know that Judah, the second half, it was for a time was under Assyrian influences. Though Northern Empire was completely under them, and now here the sons of Josiah occupying the throne of Judah, who themselves as unable to accept the role of a spy, and the next 2 decades they became constantly becoming in a conspiracy material against the Babylonians, and this actually led to the deportation of several people, but eventually to the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple that happened in 586 BC. Just hurrying up and reading because we have been coming through this a couple of times, and I think we will still go on a few times when we look at the minor prophets for next week. So, but however, Daniel was not part of the 586 BC complete destruction because he was taken in the initial time. The first time there was a deportation that happened from as Nebuchadnezzar and the empire was setting up their empire. They had looked for people who was who were powerful and who could handle stuff and who were wise in managing things, and that led to captivating or taking these people from Judah and various parts of the whoever was under Assyrian Empire. They had taken all of them and looked for the smart ones from them, picked them, chose them, and gave them a royal treat in the palace and wanted them to build a Babylonian empire. That was the aim. However, we see that Nebuchadnezzar's powerful reign came to an end when Cyrus the Great had come into the leadership. The Persian Empire, the Babylonian Empire slowly declined, and the Persians were slowly taking up. And then we see that the powerful aspect of how Cyrus was able to release them and establish the policy of release, and also helped the people of Judah to rebuild and return and rebuild their house and even the palace, even the temple of God. So all this had been the background that we are able to see from the historical context. Now, Daniel mainly served under, or these are the four kingdoms that we can see that is mentioned in the writing of Daniel. So the first 4 chapters strongly under Nebuchadnezzar, the next chapters 5 to 7 under Belshazzar, and then we see Darius the Mede, who is in the power, and then we see the stronghold of Cyrus. But chapter 10 to 12 also has more stories about the future, as we'll come to it in some time. Now, I like these two outlines of Daniel, and I thought of sharing it with you. The first 6 chapters are the stories, or those are stories of the God who protects and discloses. Now, on one side, when the beast of the world is rising up, you see God protecting his people, and also God disclosing himself to his people. Now, keep this in mind because he discloses his truth to his people. Now, that is what we are actually going to see even from Revelation chapter 7 onwards, because he is a God who is going to disclose himself, open himself, but not everybody is going to realize this. Now, there was one Daniel who recognized this, and that is the truth. Now, so on one side, we understand that God was protecting his people, but also he was disclosing the truths of the visions to his people, or the truth from God to his people. The second half is the visions of Daniel. Now, this visions of Daniel is again, as I mentioned, it is the sovereign God disclosing himself about the present and the future. He's going to let them know what is going to happen in the times to come, and that is going to help the people to remain faithful because they will understand that God is still in control of the future. Now, before getting into the text, like how we look at the divisions and study based on that, we have to look at the genre. Now, the first 6 chapters are in the form of a court narrative. Now, this is in a little scholarly stuff. A lot of people just look at it like a narrative only. A narrative, we had discussed it, where there is where there are plots, there are characters, and where there are different actions taking place. There's a rising event, and there is falling action, and all of those things we had looked at one point of time. But these stories are more, or these incidents are more didactic in nature. That means they are more in the nature of a teaching, where they are teaching the people of God how to act in the presence of oppressors. Now, as we kept on mentioning, they are in a troublesome times. They are with an oppressed class of people, where they are going to be, on one side you enjoy the privilege of being in the luxury class of the king. You might stay in a better place compiled to other people in exile, but you still have a lot of risk on your side, where if you're not ready to worship the king, if you're not ready to bow down in front of the king, if you're not ready to do things as the king does, there is going to be severe punishment that is going to come to them. So this writing of Daniel, or the prophecy of Daniel, or the lifestyle of these people, especially in the first 6 chapters, shows that trusting and obeying God will help them, or there would be. Now, this is the understanding of Old Testament times, where they will be vindicated, and even if the opposition is Babylon, they will still be defeated. They will still be able to reign if they remain faithful to God. So this message is again very strongly uh, rooted when in second century, as well as in the Roman time, as well as in today, even today, when there are oppressors all around us. But chapter 7 to 12 is a fascinating chapter. Nobody needs an interpreter to tell us or explain to us what the first 6 chapters of Daniel means. All of us know it, because we know the stories very, or these incidents very well. But the next set of chapters is where we actually need some help. And I will have to confess, I do not know everything what it is all about. And I think it is the humility that would help us to learn more and understand more. So you can disagree with me when I'm going to tell a couple of things now on, but also keep in mind about the setting, background, and all of these things when we look at it. So, what are some of the characteristics of apocalyptic writings? The first thing is an idea of a narrow eschatology. Now, eschatos is the end time, or the understanding of the end time, or the teaching. So, eschatology is like the theology that is revolving around the end time aspects of it. Now, a lot of circulations, a lot of rumors. There's a lot of teachings that is wide across about the end times and how it is. However, apocalyptics actually look beyond the end time. That means they look for the future. That is more of the right word, because for a Christian that is given a scope of hope. A lot of I keep saying this. A lot of things when we think about the end time, we are not going to think about, or we shouldn't be thinking about flights falling down or building collapsing, but we should be more thinking about the hope and the joy and the and the longingness that we have been having to be with God, and that actually speaks to us, and that is actually very clearly seen in other writings of Paul and so on, because the day of the Lord might be not a very joyous moment for the world, but for the people of God, it's a very joyous and a very glorious moment to cherish. So here is Daniel, for instance, in his eschatos. He is looking beyond the period of Persian or the Greek or the Roman oppression, because God is going to intervene and bring all the oppression to an end. And also, this New Testament understanding of the book of Daniel, or the New Testament way of referring to Daniel, is very much in close relation to regarding the coming of the Christ. Now, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7, it actually alludes the words in Daniel 7:13, where it says, "The Son of Man who rides the clouds into the presence of the ancient days," is Jesus returning at the end of history to deliver his people from oppression. Now, again, who is this ancient of days? There are opinions, there are scholarly suggestions, but this gives a clearer picture of what eschatology is all about. It's about the hopeful future that the people of God has in regard to that, in regard to their hope of the day of the Lord. Now, the second thing is the mediated revelation. Now, this is about God speaking through a mediator, like usually an angel, where God is speaking through an angel to the people, and this is through any soul, like where they are actually conveying the message, so that they will be able to understand certain truths about the end days, or about the ultimate victory of God's people, and so on. So that is an interpreting angel who conducts the apocalyptic seer on a journey by which he reveals heavenly and eschatological realities to the seer. So the seer is the prophet, or the visionary who actually experiences something, like how John has an experience in the book of Revelation, where he has the vision from God. Now that is heavenly experience. So we see that that sort of an understanding, where an apocalyptic is a sort of a mediated revelation, where the angel or the Lord is saying to them, so that they can go and convey this to the other people. It's not to keep it to them, or it is not to limit it to Daniel or John. Now the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of times people think Revelation is a mysterious book. A lot of times we think it's like we can never find out what is. Yes, I agree to that to an extent, because we are far-fetched from the time that Revelation was written. Um, so in that way, we struggle to understand the symbolisms. However, for a first century person, especially a Jew, who is very familiar with these texts, or very known to these aspects, for them this is not going to surprise, or this is not going to be a shock to them, because they are already used to this. So sort of a message coming to them, as in, because apocalyptic type of literature was all around them. It was like how we have fiction today. They had various apocalyptic writings with the same imagery, same style of writings. A lot of things that we have in Revelation, for example, are there in the various other writings of the first century, with the same explanations. So that's like a symbolic expressing. Now I'll come to that. Now here is the prophet knew it. The people of God who is going to get this, receive this message, they are also going to understand it. Now the challenge here is, if the first century Jew has to understand certain things, he is not going to understand about uh, the 20th century television, for matter, right? If Revelation is talking about the 21st century Revelation, 21st century television, now that the first century Jew who has never gone out of his small region will not probably understand it. He will probably struggle to get the details of it, right? So the reader this is a message. Now we'll come to more characteristics, but this is because the understanding is that, or the greater picture is that, when the authors are reading this, they are getting a very clear picture of what they are and what they're getting. So the prophet is getting the understanding, as well as the readers are getting this understanding. The third is the most important, I would say. The third is the unusual imageries that carry around in the writings of the apocalyptic writings. Now, from Daniel chapter 7, from Revelation chapter 4 onwards, we see unusual imageries coming into apocalyptic writings. Now, what is happening here is that they're using imageries to speak of something. Now, let me use simple examples here. Now, in John, in the Gospel of John, Jesus used a lot of I am statements, right? For example, he says, I am the vine, or I am the gate. A lot of these I am statements. Now, is it symbolically talking that I am the gate, I am the vine? Absolutely not. Now, vine had a representation of the Israel was known to be the vine. Uh, and here is God telling that I am the vine, or in the real Greek, it is like I am the new vine that is coming over there. So that's more talking in a symbolic way, right? Where he's saying about the imagery. Now, for the people who are standing there, now for us, when he say I'm the vine, we might be surprised, because we are not very familiar with this practice of imagery being used around us. But for them, they are very similar to this. They are very similar to these structures of writings. So they will be able to, a lot of them will be able to understand these writings. So these, while imagery is found in classical prophecy, it is there in poetry. the apocalyptic imageries are bizarre. Now they go sometime extreme. We do not understand. From one side there might be a lion coming, and from the other side a lamb is coming. We might not be able to picturize this. How can this be possible? They say, here is going to be the Lion of Judah, and then when they turn around, they're not going to see a lion; they're going to see a lamb. Now they might be wondering, how is this possible? Now that's how apocalyptic works, because apocalyptic works in such a way that the people is going to be fascinated, as well as they're going to understand that this message very well. So evil is pictured, as well as evil kingdoms is represented. And especially if you look at the ways, all the persecutions in the first 6 chapters in Daniel are because God's people stood faithful, right? Now, in the history of Israel, we cannot tell that because most of the persecutions or the oppressions came as a result of their disobedience. However, in looking at the Daniel context, here all the incidents is because they stood faithful. Daniel stood faithful, his friends stood faithful, all of them together in the first chapter stood faithful, and they had to undergo oppression. Now, why is that happening? Because this is the beast. Who is the beast? The beast here is representing to the kingdom of Babylon. What is happening? The Babylonian Empire here is persecuting them, right? And we see in Second Peter, I believe, an expression that there is no more Babylon. Babylonian is out of picture by the time Peter is writing, but he says, there is this Babylon, right? But who is the Babylon? It is an imagery that Peter is using to talk about Rome. Why? Because if you're going to simply write, okay, Rome is going to be judged by God, this is going to be a circulated letter that can bring harm to the people around. So they are using imageries well known, very clear to them, so that they will be able to convey the message that they are understanding. So the struggle here is, now when I am a 21st century reader trying to look at this, I will try to classify it based on what I can see and I can relate around. When I look around, I look at this particular instance in Revelation chapter 11, and I say, oh, wow, how can people all around the world going to see that particular event of the prophets coming and testifying? Okay, it surely has to be some media. It can be something that God is going to use to show everyone of the world. That is a good way of looking at it, but that is not the best way of looking at it. The reason being, for a first century person, that is never, he cannot even fathom that, right? Because I know it is okay to disagree in this matters. However, it is also good to understand that or read through at least little of the other text. When we study Revelation, one of the mandatory requirement of the courses were to read the other apocalyptic literature, and it was actually fascinating because there are other literature also who's having the same symbols and so on. Let's move further because it's already half the time of today's class. So imageries and then the setting of oppression. Now this is where the background comes to play. The people are in terrible times here in the context of Daniel, in the context of Revelation. The people are they are tortured, they are burned alive. And this is not a very easy time for people to live in. It's an oppressed class of society. It's a time when people are wanting to somehow get out of this. And at that point of time is when this message is conveyed to them. We do not see, especially in the biblical times, biblical literature, we do not see an apocalyptic literature coming out of a pleasant time. It always came out of an oppressed situation. It always came out of suffering. It always came during the time of difficulties. So this makes us understand that I have just mentioned something from the slide. You can read it alongside if you want. So just keeping this in mind, right? Keeping all these things in mind, it always came during an oppressed time. It always came during a time when people were struggling. But what was the intention, right? What was the intention of the people when they had given this? The intention was simply the hope, right? There was no other intention. It was, okay, there was hope, but also the ethics of Christian life. We'll come to that. That means here is the author, Daniel or John or Ezekiel, who are trying to convey this picture of telling them, no, this is not limited to this extent. the maximum they can do is to a certain limit. After that, they are, they cannot do anything because they are not the ultimate in power. And because of that, here is the powerful ones, right? The powerful one is God, who is a sovereign one, and He is the barrier. He is going to bring out us victoriously, the people of God victoriously. So, what do they have to do? They have to do this. They have to remain in God. They have to remain in the laws of God. They have to remain in the teachings, and they have to continue faithfully abiding in God. That was the message that apocalyptic literature always try to give. So when we look at it through that lens of oppression, and when we look at the command of hope that they're getting, or the command to remain holy and be with God, we see a clearer understanding of what Revelation is, or even First Daniel is all about. So we also see that there is a deterministic view of history that we see in the book of Daniel, right? So many have characterized Daniel as a pessimistic, because Daniel is telling very clearly that judgment cannot be avoided. In fact, he is telling them that the judgment is going to be double the times of, or different, 7 times the times of what the judgment has been promised. So it is not going to be an easy time or an easy message that they're getting. However, from the perspective of the author and his faithful audience, this opposite is true. Why? Because God is going to deliver them, and the deliverance is going to be a hope that is going to be realized in the distant future. And that is a hope that they have over there. But again, there is going to be, as people are not turning to God, we see the picture where they are going after false teachers. We saw in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, we see how their hearts are are like stones and not going to God. And we see how the punishment are extended. And the final aspect of apocalyptic writing is pseudonomity. Now, people usually, especially in the extra canonical, or the books that we do not include in the canons, prophecies, especially in terms of apocalyptics, are pseudonymous in nature. The reason why it is pseudonymous in nature is because they try to hide their reality. The reason why they hide is because they do not want to get into trouble. They do not want to bring a sort of an understanding that will bring them in any trouble. So they probably use a right. So that's why we have a writing of Enoch. Now, Enoch is a long figure and holds a very prominent figure in the history of Israel, but they use his name to convey a message so that people will be able to read and so on. However, we see that for Daniel, I strongly believe Daniel's authorship, and for Revelation, for Ezekiel, the last portions, we see all this picture that all these apocalyptic writings are not from pseudonymous sources, but they are from sources which has authors, and biblically grounded readings of the text will help us to realize that John and Daniel and Ezekiel are behind many of these texts. Now, as I conclude, right, these brings two important reasons, or two important ways to look at it. On one side, to the people of God, apocalyptic literature is revealing truths to the people. That means it is revealing. You had something blur, and now you're with the apocalyptic literature, you are having a better clarity. You are revealing, God is revealing certain truths to you. But also for Babylon, it is being concealed. It is being hidden. It is being, they are not able to recognize it. When they read, if they're going to read it, when they read it, they're not going to understand it. They might look at it like, what is this? They are not going to recognize it probably. But when the people of God reads it, they will be able to understand it. So it's like revealing and concealing for the people of God. And over there. Now, another important truth about, or fact about the book of Daniel, which is very interesting, is the use of two languages. Now, Aramaic is like a cousin language of Hebrew, where only the first chapter of Daniel and to second chapter verse 4 is written in Hebrew. Which, see, the prominent amount of Old Testament is entirely filled with Hebrew. There are very little Aramaic we see in the entire Old Testament also. So, however, in Daniel, this middle portion of from chapter 2 to chapter 7 is fully in Aramaic, and then the author is again coming back from chapter 8 to chapter 12, where he again uses the picture of Hebrew. So there's two languages involved over here, right? There's also, as I mentioned, there is two genres and two languages involved over here. Now, the purpose of the Daniel's message is the sovereignty of God, showing how God is the ultimate control in political and spiritual arenas. And also in the narrative events in the life of Daniel and friends, the emphasis of how living a life of faith in an increasingly hostile world. Also, God's sovereignty is seen in his ability to prosper or deliver those who are truly convicted of their faith. So these are some of the purpose that we can find from Daniel. Now let me move quite fast into the first 6 writings of Daniel. Now we are very aware of what is happening in the first 6 chapters of Daniel. So here is Daniel and his 3 friends, who is coming into the Babylonian court as smart people, who are very capable of doing a lot of wonderful things, and here they comes, and we know what happens. They get a royal treatment, and they are given the king's food, the king's aspect. A lot of times we say they defile them. They did not defile themselves by not having king's food. However, why was it a defilement? It is because of the law. Now, this is where again I keep saying about it. There is always anything, maybe prophetical writing, maybe wisdom. The law plays a significant role in the history of the Hebrew people, because we see the reason why these people abstained. It is not because they did not want to, or it is not because it did not interest them. A lot of things interest us, but why do we do not go after them? That is because of the law that stands over them. And here it is the that we see and how God honors their decision. Now, chapter 2 is again fascinating, right? Now, keep chapter 2 in mind, because here is Nebuchadnezzar seeing a vision, and we see the dramatic instances in the way that the author had described on how Daniel becomes a source of instrument, whereas the people who are over there, it is this dream is not, they are not able to interpret the dreams. But for Daniel, this becomes comes into play, and he comes to the king and says, okay, this is what the dream is all about. It is about 4 earthly kingdoms represented, and all of those things. So keep in mind this particular figurative aspect coming over here, because something similar will repeat in chapter 7. Now here is again a picture where they were actually talking about the way Babylon went up as a kingdom, and then how they came down as a kingdom. So we know these narratives well, and it is important that that we look at it from the eyes of the law, because the reason why the people of the other people in the context were not able to recognize, whereas for Daniel it was revealing, for others it was concealing. And in chapter 3, we see Daniel's friends. Right? Here, there's the other 3 boys who are not ready to bow down in front of the king. Again, why? Because of the law. The law does not permit them to do it. And here is the Babylonian Empire, which strongly emphasized to worship Nebuchadnezzar's 90-foot tall golden idol, and they were not ready to do it. Why? Because of the law. And because of that, they were thrown into the fiery furnace. And we see God miraculously rescuing them. Nebuchadnezzar testifying about God's goodness over there, or the greatness of the God of Hebrews. Look at this pattern. Chapter 2 and 3 interlined together to show the sort of the power that lies with the sovereign God of the Hebrews. And then chapter 4 is about how the Nebuchadnezzar's dream where he's coming down and he is his entire pride is becoming the source of his hindrance, and he becomes a beast. He becomes someone who is oppressed, and now all the glorious nature of his mansions and everything that he had is gone, and he has been in such a downfall. And we know the story. He prayed, and God restored everything to him. So look at this. Chapter 4 is in some ways again a pride-filled man, somebody who thought he conquered the world. But here is this man in his downfall, God again restoring things to him. But look at the next chapter, which is about his son. We know the story very well. I do not want to explain it much. So here is the feast, and the Babylonians are defiling again. Look at the law, right? What are they doing? They're taking the holy vessels from the temple and they're eating and drinking from it. Right? They're eating and drinking from it. And what is the issue? Because these are set apart materials for the temple, for the worship of Yahweh. This was against the law of God. And now, here on one side, you see in chapter 4, the king Nebuchadnezzar who returned to God, or in fact, when we see the picture, was pride filled but turned to God, and God restored him. But here is his son who is pride filled, and we see that the wordings coming over there, right? Mene tekel upharsin, and how Daniel is interpreting it for him, that the fall of Babylon is coming, and how the judgment is going to come from Yahweh. So that's the contrast. So here we see chapter 5 and 6 interlined, 4 and 5 interlined together. Now again a miraculous event. Now look at chapter 1, chapter 2, and again in chapter 6. I hope now it is right. In chapter 6, again the miraculous event. Where here is a faithful servant following God, following all the responsibilities that he has to do to the king. But because of his faith, he comes into a question. Again, what is the issue? Because he follows the law, right? Chapters 1, 3, and 6 shows the religious faithfulness of Daniel and his friends. And because of the religious faithfulness, they get attacked. Now, keep this strongly in mind. Religious faithfulness, they get oppressed by the Babylonians or by the beast, we can call them. Why do we call them the beast? Because they are out of arrogance, out of pride, they're attacking the people of God. And why are they doing it? To oppress them, to think that they subdue over everything else of the world. Keeping this in mind, let's move to chapter 7. Now, chapter 7 is again a very interesting chapter, right? Here is the Ancient of Days. Here it proclaims as God as the Ancient of Days. Now, one strongly important aspect over here is the picture of 4 different beasts that come out, or 4 different creation that comes out. And we see that finally we also see the picture of the Son of Man. Right? Now, who is the Son of Man? Now, the Son of Man is firstly introduced here in chapter. Now, we looked at Ezekiel, Son of Man, where Ezekiel was called a Son of Man. But here is the picture where Daniel is getting this revelation of the Son of Man, who is going to be a son, who is going to be from the line of David, but who is going to reign with the power of God in the entire world. He's going to be a judge to the world, and he's going to reign and destroy the power of the wicked ones, and he's going to reign. So here we see that promise of the Son of Man, and we see this promise being fulfilled, or we see Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and all, especially Matthew and Mark, emphasizing on these terms a lot. In Mark's purpose statement itself, he says the Son of Man came to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. So here we see the picture where Daniel is for the first time, he's introducing this picture of a Son of Man. And from then, this became like a promise. This became like a hope that they were waiting for the Son of Man. So here we see chapters 7 and 8 interlining, where they are using intimately related, even though they are in different languages, strongly connected, even though they are one is in Hebrew and one is in Aramaic. So here is 4 kingdoms again. Right? Here is talking about 4 kingdoms again, represented as 4 animals that are increasingly more terrible in appearance as well as conduct. So here it talks about, just like our chapter 2. Chapter 2, you saw a huge huge statue, and that was talking about four kingdoms. Here it is again talking about the four kingdoms. Now, the proposed identification of the beast in chapter 7 are usually this, right? So, the first most people claim is Babylon, definitely there, Medo Persia, Greece, and Rome. But we got to keep in mind that Rome is a little far fetched. Rome is a little apart from what is going to come. So some of them do not take Medo and Persia to be different. Some of them take it different, and some of them keep it same, because Rome came much later, towards when Daniel was writing about peace. So they consider Babylon, Medo Persia, and Greece as some authentic. So whoever this is, or whichever arrangement this is, these are probably the states or the nations that are being spoken about, because these are immediately in context. Now, why have scholars, or why do we limit it to this? Is because these are immediately in context with what is happening. Now, Persia is over there, Medo is over there, Babylon is right now in power, and this is the picture that we actually have over there. One of the last, out of the last one emerges a pompous little form that speaks rebellious words, defile God's authority, persecute God's people. Right now, from here again, there is a small shift of turn. Now, here is someone who comes, who is going to defile God's authority and persecute God's people. Let's keep it in whole, keeping this in mind. As Daniel watches, he sees in the vision that Ancient of Days and one like the Son of Man, who together establish a fifth and final kingdom, an eternal kingdom of saint of the Most High. The vision of chapter 8 foresees two of the creatures in more detail. Again, an earthly human empire is responsible for bringing out the suffering on the people of God. So we see that it is a human kingdom that is bringing the suffering to God's people. Again, coming to what is, because the entire thing, what I believe is, it is all talking about what we're going to come across. In chapter 9, here it is Daniel who is in a prayer, who is in attitude of prayer, where he is studying the book of Jeremiah, and he is praying for the exile to end. Right? We see this Daniel's vision of the 70 periods of time that we see over here. Right, so this is where he is praying for Judah's forgiveness and restoration, where the angel of the Lord is coming to him and giving him the mysterious revelation of the 70 weeks. Or in fact, there are many opinions about this. There are many people who again talk about all of these. What is the 70 weeks that they are talking about? And so on. Some of them take it literally, some of them are still looking ahead of it. A lot of the premillennial teachings are looking ahead to these events, but also in light of the history, when we look at it, we'll be able to understand some things. So yeah. So the final things, right? I'm just quickly moving. The final things that we can able to understand is in chapters 10 to 12. It is about Daniel's dramatic vision, in which he sees an attempt to destroy Judaism in the 2nd century BC by the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, this is probably where the story is revolving all around. Right now, here is where a lot of scholars disagree that probably Daniel is writing this, because it talks about in a much later period of time. Now, we know, most of us know the story of Antiochus Epiphanes. He is coming in like the 2nd century BCE, and one of the greatest threats to Israel. Now, to understand, especially to the New Testament, we definitely have to go and study the Second Temple period, the intertestamental period well, and because that will help us to understand a lot of details that is coming in much better. But also to understand certain aspect of this, we need to know a little bit of this history. He was the greatest threat to Israel. Now, a lot of what we saw in even in Ezekiel last week is connected to this probably, right? Now, I would use the word probably because I'm also learning with these, and there are a lot of opinions here in these thing. I'm giving studies from my side, and we can go and explore the other sides of it also. So here is Antiochus Epiphanes, and who was in the Roman prison, and then he get released, and he comes and he becomes a king of the Seleucids, and he becomes, or he uses the method of Hellenization. Now, Hellenization is where the Greeks use Hellenization. Alexander the Great started it. That's how the people of God, the Israelites, changed from Hebrew to Greek, right? That's how their entire shift happened, because they introduced new culture and all of them to them Hellenization. Now, he considered himself as a deity, he considered himself as a god in some ways, but he was a madman in every little term. Though he brought Seleucids to victory over Ptolemies, he had a great threat from the Roman Empire. Now, what challenged or what actually happened is he was arrested by the Roman Empire. And because he was arrested by the Roman Empire, he got furious. He somehow wanted to destroy Rome and destroy them. And so for that, he wanted to gain power and gain wealth. So he robbed temples, because temples at that point of time had gold and had a lot of wealth in them. So he wrote temples, and he increased taxation to the people. And the greatest defilement to the Hebrew people was two main things. One, the office of the high priest. This man sold off what was holy and what was solely given by God. He sold off the office of the high priest to a pagan person, sold it off. And then we see he made the temple of Jerusalem as the worship place of Zeus, and offered the sacrifice of a pig on the altar of incense, or as we call it, the abomination, desolation, where where he that can never ever be taught by a Jew about these things happening. Defiled the temple, and that is when we see the Maccabean revolt, and now the history goes on. So this person has done a lot of ruins over there, and it was one of the most terrible period for the Jews, because their spiritual identity was completely lost because of this. And we know that this is like a silent period. This is like the intertestamental period, the time between both the testaments. And hopefully, if you're doing a New Testament series in time, we should be able to look at these first, and then start studying the New Testament to understand it better in the context. Because that's when Pharisees came up. That's when a lot of movements from the Jewish system came out, revolting and standing firm for faith, and so on. So here is this man who is becoming a source or a fulfillment of prophecy from a lot of these people, right? From Ezekiel's understanding, from Daniel's understanding. A lot of these prophecies are very well fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. So, though he is unable to annihilate the people of God, he inflicts unprecedented suffering on them. And finally, the book concludes that even the people of God do not know when the victory of God's people are going to come. That means they do not know the timing of God's final victory. They have to wait patiently for God to work in them. Now, what is the final message of Daniel? Before coming to that, now I believe that it was directly probably fulfilled in Antiochus Epiphanes. However, this message of Daniel can be to all of us, because Jesus uses Daniel's statement while talking about the end times. Now, it can be about all of these, right? It can be about the Roman Empire, who again were persecuting the people of God. It was about the Antiochus Epiphanes, and also these are mainly the three interpretations. One, Antiochus Epiphanes; second, it is the Roman Empire; the third, that it is the upcoming, the final persecution or the final end time events that are over there. Now, it can be related to all of this, right? Because it talks about, on one side, the beast. Who is this beast? Antiochus Epiphanes. Why is he oppressing the people of God who are staying faithful and remaining in the covenant of God? Because they want to destroy for personal benefits. But on the other side, if the people of God remain faithful, there is a God who is going to deliver them. The time is not clear. When is he going to do it? We are not sure. But there is definitely a promise that God has given up. the final message of Daniel is this, you know, message for the exilic and post-exilic communities who are expected to establish God's kingdom after their return from the exile. Daniel informed that it would not be very soon. Four empires would come prior to it. You know, look at the time period it took for the entire uh, people to get back. You know, four empires had to come in the power, and in the midst of it, God's people had to remain faithful to Him under the oppression and persecution, and trust Him to fulfill His promises amidst the rise and fall of the world empires. Let me remind you something else and close it today. If you remember, in the Hebrew order, in the canonical order that the Hebrews have placed, they do not keep the book of Daniel in the session of prophets, right? They keep the book of Daniel in the session of writings because they believe that it was happening. This was more of an instructional material to them. It was like it was like a way that they should live. More like showing these few lives of faithful ones and challenging them to live like them because they were covenant faithful, law abiding, Yahweh following Israelites, whereas the beast were from their own were doing everything for their own benefits, and they were rising up to destroy the people of God for their own benefits. But Jews have always, or the Hebrew Bible have put this in certain order so that it would be like an instruction for people to follow, just like how Revelation is like an instruction for the people of God to follow and to obey God and to live in times of difficulty. And it's a challenge to us also. Daniel, Revelation speaks to us, to live a challenging life, to live a life modeling after God, even during this difficult time. May God bless us all for the session. Can I ask Pastor to conclude in prayer?
Father, we thank you.